be honest. When is the last time you actually saw a Newcastle running around in Apex Legends? Everyone seems to have forgotten that he exists, and if we take a look at his history, it seems like Respawn has only released one single patch to Newcastle in the entire year that he's been in the game, so maybe they forgot about him too. I mean, at the time of this video, Newcastle only sits on a 1.1% pick rate and is by far the least picked legend in the game, which is quite a contrast to his release pick rate in Season 13, where he sat on almost 10 times the same pick rate, with a pick rate of around 10%. Mind you, this was a much weaker Newcastle than the one we have today, and lots of players saw the promise and the potential of the legend, myself included, but still, it only took one season for him to be forgotten, to be buried, and out of the public consciousness. So what happened? How did a new space-creating legend, who was supposed to be a combination of Gibraltar and Lifeline, and better than them both, end up in the trash? Today we will go over the quick introduction and the equally as fast downfall of Newcastle, the legend that everyone forgot about. Newcastle was released on the 10th of May 2022 with the launch of Season 13, allowing some changes to Stormpoint and the typical meta changes you'll see around a new season. Upon its release, Newcastle would receive a lot of attention from the pros and streamers alike, as his kit allowed for speedy resets, which is a very useful skill to have in Ranked, as well as the ability to create space where there may not be enough space to hold a position from, which necessarily wasn't super important for Ranked itself, as it was a slugfest across all levels, once they reverted back from the Season 13 Ranked changes. But it was something that was incredibly valuable once you started looking at, very high tier Ranked, scrimmages, and tournaments like the ALGS. And thanks to all this positive attention, despite a slow 3.8 pick rate around the very start of the season, Newcastle quickly shot up to over a 10% pick rate, solidifying his place as one of the most picked legends in Apex. His pick rate was even exacerbated after this hilarious bug was found, which somehow allowed players to start a revive and get the hell out of dodge in light speed. Even better, seeing as Newcastle's kit was essentially the same as Lifeline's, with the ability to revive when moving and still having the shield for protection like Lifeline used to in her previous iterations. Many players were questioning the point of even having a Lifeline in the first place, with some diehard mains actually making the switch to the better support legend. But all in all, it didn't take too long until the public opinion started to change. Because despite the initial public interest, the interest in Newcastle quickly began to taper off, and just 1 month later, Newcastle had gone from a 10% pick rate all the way down to a measly pick rate of just 2.7. So what happened? Well, a quick glance through the patch notes doesn't really mention any direct changes to Newcastle in this short period of time. In fact, there weren't really any meaningful changes other than fixing Newcastle's speed glitch about 2 weeks after he had been released. But even though this could be considered a catalyst, he already had started seeing a dip at this point. And at the time of the fix releasing, Newcastle was already looking at a 5.8% pick rate. Of course, the bug fix didn't help, and again, I'm sure it was a contributing factor towards his popularity, but that's probably not it. So what was the real reason why he fell off so hard? Chances are Newcastle was overhyped from the start, and he was only seeing a lot of play because larger streamers were playing him. And as we all know, a large majority of the player base will start mimicking whatever meta the pros and thus the streamers is following, at least to the point of running a fun, supposedly meta-changing legend like Newcastle. Because with the hype, Newcastle had seen a lot of play in the following Apex Legends Global Series and their respective scrims, with players trying him out in every region and in every level of play, with varying levels of success. But despite the initial hype, there wasn't really any team that really nailed that Newcastle playstyle, and teams went from playing Newcastle on both the competitive maps, that being World's Edge and Stormpoint, to only playing him on Stormpoint, as that map is a lot more open, with lots of endings without cover, where a legend who can create cover would see a lot more value, to eventually phasing him out completely in favor of more relevant compositions, with many teams returning to the tried and true Watson, Valkyrie, and Seer combination, or even pulling up some Bangalore, who also can manipulate space, but in many ways better. But despite all doubts, one team stayed true to the Newcastle and kept running him despite everyone else giving up on him. We're talking about a team with a position-based playstyle named 100 Thieves, consisting of 3 mouse and keyboard users who saw the value in the legend, where if they don't get a good position in the end game, instead of taking risky fights and challenging the controller-dominated pro NA scene, which they were bound to lose, they could simply just create a position themselves, and 100 Thieves kept making it work, taking fun positions, winning some end games, and just doing overall well for themselves. But I know most people don't care about comp, so that's enough esports for now. Let's fast forward to right before Season 14 was released, so about 90 days later. At this point, things were looking grim for Newcastle, as he was only sitting at around a 1.5% pick rate across the board. The developers knew something had to happen, so they finally rolled out the one update that they ever have done to Newcastle. And naturally, you'd expect this to be a huge, game-breaking update that instantly makes him overpowered, right? I mean, they only did one of them, it has to be good, right? Well, that's not exactly what happened. And while this pick rate did go up by almost 200% with the release of Season 14, that's still really only going from 1.4% pick rate to a peak of about 2.8. In this patch, Respawn decided to keep the same identity, but up Newcastle's power a little bit. They decided to do so by making his passive a lot stronger, increasing the move speed when reviving by 25%, they reduced the turn slow while reviving by 50%, and increased the health of the white and blue knockdown shields. His tactical saw changes as well, with the health of the barrier increasing by some margin, but most notably, it now moved twice as fast, which allowed you to do a lot more shield plays, as the previous version was just too slow to actually be used in real in-game scenarios, other than practically being a static wall. And speaking of static walls, his ultimate, the Castle Wall, also received a buff, and now started stunning affected players' turn speed as well as their movement speed to make them easier to kill if they do touch the electric side. And yeah, like I mentioned, this did up his pick rate marginally, but at the end of the day, the community had already decided that he wasn't a worthwhile pick, and no patches short of an insanely huge buff would affect the community's interest in this already down bad legend. And while we have seen revivals of some legends suddenly being abused despite not seeing any meaningful changes in a long period of time, Newcastle is yet to be abused to the extent that we've seen with, for example, Seer, who has Watson picked up as a troll pick, which somehow ended up defining the meta forever. And of course, as I mentioned, 100 Thieves has been trying in competitive Apex, and they're still to this day trying their damn best to force that Newcastle pick and making something for themselves. And while they are doing okay, I mean, they are in Pro League and they are placing decently after all, they're certainly not having the impact that would make other teams run a Newcastle like we've seen with Seer in the past. And I've been starting to wonder, what if the reason why we haven't seen any more updates to Newcastle's kit in almost a whole year is because maybe he's actually, like, really good? Like, ignore what I just said. What if we have another Seer situation in our hands, but no team or player has figured out how to use him properly? I mean, I've been suggesting Newcastle to my teammates quite a few times, but nobody really wanted to get in on it. And I definitely think that with the right strategy, with the right player, Newcastle could theoretically have a huge impact to any game. And maybe that is why Respawn are so hesitant on changing him up, because they know that he is actually a sleeper pick, and they know that if they do buff him, it will cause a super lopsided meta where he would dominate. For all we know, maybe Newcastle has an insanely high win rate despite the low pick rate, and that's why we haven't seen any changes to the kit. I mean, either that or I guess Respawn just sort of forgot. Either way, I noticed that I talked a lot about Seer in this video, so if you guys do want to hear more about his story and how Seer broke Apex, check out the video on the screen. If you guys enjoyed the video, hit the like, subscribe, and of course, I'll see you all tomorrow. Peace out.